going to start by covering our definition of the ethical intent to action gap. We'll move on to discuss how this is reflective of our personal goals and the behaviors that we'd like to design into our lives. We'll discuss the gap between the stated values an organization explicitly communicates and the behavioral realities of that very same organization. We'll touch quickly on the impact that this ethical intent to action gap has on trust, and we'll also talk about the relationship between ethics and competence when it comes to company trust. Today we have two key learner outcomes. Number one, we want to develop a basic understanding of the ethical intent to action gap. We want to start understanding what it means in business. We also want to develop a practical understanding of how this relates to the work that you do in your professional context. Let's start with the definition. As we define it, the ethical intent to action gap is where an organization explicitly communicates values or actions that it will commit to, but doesn't follow through. Let me provide a useful but kind of scary example. One of the big four banks here in Australia often talks about things like environmental sustainability. Yet over the last few years, they have funded the fossil fuels industry to the tune of $17 billion. No wonder organizations are being accused of ethics washing. In a personal context, let me highlight something pretty much every single one of us can empathize with. Have you made a New Year's resolution? I have. This research comes from a pretty large study in the UK that Bupa conducted. What they found was that 26% of people made a resolution, only 12% of those people kept it, 50% lost motivation. There's lots of reasons why this is the case. And in the next lesson, we're going to be sharing some behavioral design models that do a pretty good job of describing why, in so many cases, when we want to do something, we don't end up following through. In an organizational context, this is similar but different. We've already provided that example about the Big Four bank, but let's just hammer this home a little bit more. This research from the MIT Sloan School of Management is really useful in this context, and they found that there was no correlation between the cultural values that a company emphasizes in its published statements, its explicit communication, and how well that very same company lives up to those values in the eyes of employees. So they say this, but they actually do this. There's a big gap between those two states. And it's important to note that this has a material impact on trust. This isn't just trying to do the right thing. It's that, but it's more. And business leaders should be paying attention. The Edelman Trust Barometer is a wonderful resource. If you're not paying attention to it, I would highly recommend that you do. And one of the things that they called out in this year's 2020 Trust Barometer was that no institution is seen as both competent and ethical. We all want to be here in this category, right? This glorified category where we're amazingly competent at what we do and our integrity and dependability is super high. You know, people really like us. They buy into what we're doing. They buy into our why, as Simon Sinek might put it. But as you'll see here, business barely edges into the competence category. NGOs barely get into the ethics category. There is an ethics failure, and there's something that's got to change if we are going to move into this desired quadrant right here. Now, before we wrap up, let's just talk really quickly about just how important ethics is when it comes to trust. This data also comes from the Edelman Trust Barometer, and what it proposes is that ethics is 3 times more important to company trust than competence. That's huge. Now, if we are to close the ethical intent to action gap, greater than learning's purpose, it starts with tiny ethical actions.